A symbiotic relationship is defined as any interaction that concerns two different organisms. Many organisms have actually evolved to have their lives rely on symbiotic relationships, like mutualism, that they've developed in nature. Mutualism is just one variety of symbiosis where both organisms associate benefit in some fashion. The needs of organisms that participate in mutualism tend to contrast each other. For the organisms, this makes for a mutual dependency on each other. The term symbiosis is also utilized for two other relations among organisms, parasitism and commensalism. For plants specifically, they develop mutualistic relationships with one another for many of the same reasons as other organisms do, like animals or bacteria. They do not have their own unique purposes for forming a mutualistic relationship. All organisms, plants included, establish mutualistic relationships for aid in reproduction, housing, nourishment, and security. Mutualism concerning fungi is one of the most prevalent relations in nature. Scientists refer to mutualism found between fungus and plants as a mycorrhiza. This interaction begins when fungus grows through the plant's root system. The fungus profits from this by being able to reach the food that's given off by the plant. The plant benefits by being able to more effectively take in water and other nutrients, which is allowed by the presence of fungus. Scientists have identified four leading explanations of why the world's oceans continue to expand. Rising oceans are predominantly induced when, in just 1 year, trillions of pounds of ice thaw and fall into open waters. Melting ice occurs around the globe and can be sourced everywhere from ice sheets to glaciers near mountains. Antarctica and Greenland are in fact responsible for a lot of the ice that enters the oceans. The swelling of water, otherwise known as thermal expansion, is the second reason why ocean levels have been trending upwards. Each year, ocean temperatures steadily increase, which enlarges the water. How much exactly is contingent upon the depth of the warming water. Ocean water levels have already raised about 6 inches from thermal expansion since the year 1950. The Gulf Stream and descending land masses are two other factors of increasing sea levels that are a little more unfamiliar compared to the other two. All the ice that is currently disappearing is prompting the Gulf Stream, a process that distributes water, to diminish. This means the Gulf Stream is unable to effectively move water where it needs to go, so it accumulates in areas such as Florida. Land masses fall deeper into the earth when water located underground gets depleted or when the tectonic plates shift. Ocean levels are then allowed to climb further onto shore when land masses drop. Regardless of why ocean volumes continue to grow, the focus in the scientific community is largely on what this reality means for human species. Coastal cities would likely encounter devastating storm surges, persistent flooding, shoreline deterioration, and general threats from storms. Invasive species are designated as any organism that has the ability to cause harm to an environment that they're not originally from. Typical invasive organisms would include bacteria, insects, and fungus. Invasive species all share similar characteristics like fast reproduction and vigorous population growth. Ordinary actions humans participate in, like transporting products, whether it be on a global or regional level, are mostly to blame for the spreading of invasive species. An example of this would be when invasive insects penetrate shipping containers and pallets that are being moved all over the earth. Another known reason why invasive species are introduced into foreign environments is because of climate change. Things like varying weather conditions and hotter average temperatures can incite an invasive species to relocate into a different ecosystem. One of the many destructive consequences of an invasive species being present is on the environment. The course of action many invasive species take to accomplish this is through the relations within an ecosystem's food web. It is not unusual for an invasive species to have no predators within an ecosystem that they may have just established themselves in. This is often a result of local organisms not having a chance to adapt to the new predator, or simply because they're incapable of contending with it. For the local species, this means that their numbers could be severely reduced or eliminated altogether. If an invasive predator completely removes an original organism from a particular food web, then balance within the ecosystem would no longer exist. For instance, when there are no predators to limit herbivore numbers, they may increase uncontrollably, which would then devastate that ecosystem's vegetation. A niche, or ecological role, is described as every interaction, biotic and abiotic, that deals with a particular organism. An organism's purpose is outlined by both living and non-living relationships. Predation or mutualism are two types of relations an organism could have with other organisms. Weather patterns and even certain varieties of soil are two relationships an organism may have with its surroundings. These things would either be something an organism requires for its survival or something it can utilize to benefit itself. Each species that is involved in an ecosystem has its own niche. No two species will employ the same niche in an ecosystem. If two organisms are fighting over the exact same natural resources, then one will inevitably become obsolete. On the other hand, if two ecological functions only moderately collide with one another, then the two species should be able to live in harmony. Generally speaking, the more distinct an ecological niche is from others, the fewer conflicts an organism would have to deal with. The evolution of a species niche is an emerging issue that has multiple investigations currently being conducted on it. It has been hypothesized that if a species fills an obscure niche, then they'll probably be more susceptible to variations, These changes are believed to be caused by a concept termed disruptive selection. Disruptive selection commonly occurs in communities with large concentrations of a certain species. Within these communities, competition is usually pretty high, which means that natural resources are scarce. Disruptive selection ultimately results in divided species, and once a species separates, they'll move into different niches, so natural resource competition will decrease. One of the most famous examples of disruptive selection concerns Darwin's finches found on the Galapagos Islands. Disruptive selection for this species of bird resulted in medium-sized beaks being almost completely removed from the population. The diverging beak sizes of the finches led to some alterations in their niche. Beak dimensions can determine what type of food the finches consume, as well as the characteristics of their mating calls. In ecology, dispersal is recognized as the action of organisms relocating to different breeding locations. Scientists have broken down dispersal into two main varieties, natal and breeding. These two kinds of dispersal are really only separated by when a species decides to breed. Natal dispersal occurs when species migrate before reproducing, and breeding dispersal transpires when species relocate after reproducing. Dispersal of a species primarily operates as a way of limiting how large and dense a population is. It can also create a broad range of impacts on a migrating population itself, as well as on populations faced with receiving a foreign species. Some examples would include smaller populations being driven to extinction because of too much dispersal, and a species forming a lower fitness because of too little dispersal. Dispersal can look very different for each species. Some organisms disperse passively, which is no participation in the process, and actively, which is some participation in the process. Passive dispersal may look like plants depending on the flow of air. Active dispersal may look like birds flying somewhere without any aid. Today, one of the leading obstacles to why this procedure may be ineffective is how humans have used the land available to them. When humans engage in practices like farming or urbanization, or construct things like reservoirs, they typically break up an ecosystem into smaller pieces. Anything from roads to farms can make these pieces totally secluded from one another. This is all known as habitat fragmentation, and the separation it causes not infrequently alters how a species disperses and migrates.